6 months after the gym incident, Sarah stood in front of 300 recruits at the Navy's Special Warfare Training Center in San Diego. She had been asked to speak to the newest class of SEAL candidates about mental toughness and perseverance. Looking out at the audience, she saw exactly what she expected: mostly young men in peak physical condition, a few women scattered throughout the group, and expressions ranging from confidence to barely concealed terror. 6 months ago, Sarah began, I was working as a part-time trainer at a small gym, trying to live a quiet civilian life. I thought my military service was behind me, just a chapter in my personal history that I could keep private. Then 4 men decided to rob that gym on a night when I was working alone. The recruits listened intently. Most of them had heard some version of her story, but they were curious to hear it directly from her. Those men made a critical error in judgment, Sarah continued. They looked at me and saw what they expected to see: a small woman who would be easy to intimidate. They never considered that I might have training that would make their size advantage irrelevant. She paused, making eye contact with several of the female recruits. The same thing happened to me during SEAL training. Instructors, fellow candidates, even some of my family members looked at me and saw limitations instead of possibilities. They focused on what I couldn't do instead of what I might be capable of achieving. Sarah walked closer to the audience. The most important lesson I learned during training wasn't about combat techniques or physical conditioning. It was about mental preparation. When you're facing an impossible challenge, your mind will try to convince you to quit long before your body actually fails. One of the male recruits raised his hand. Ma'am, how do you overcome that mental barrier when you're physically smaller than your opponents? It was a question Sarah had heard many times in the past 6 months. You stop thinking about size and start thinking about technique, she replied. In that gym, I wasn't trying to be stronger than 4 men. I was using their expectations against them, staying mobile, and applying the training I had received. Here, she gestured around the training facility. Everything you learn in this program has a purpose. The rope climbing builds grip strength and mental toughness. The long swims teach you to push through discomfort. The weapons training develops muscle memory that works under stress. When I needed those skills in that gym, they were there automatically. Bravery, female recruit in the 3rd row, spoke up. How did you deal with people who said women don't belong in special operations? Sarah smiled. I stopped listening to what people said and started focusing on what I could do. During Hell Week, when instructors were screaming at me to quit, I didn't waste energy arguing with them. I just kept moving forward. The questions continued for another 30 minutes. Sarah found herself enjoying the opportunity to share what she had learned with the next generation of SEAL candidates. These recruits would face the same challenges she had overcome, and some of them would discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. After the formal presentation, several recruits approached Sarah individually. A young woman from Oklahoma told her that her family had tried to discourage her from attempting SEAL training, but Sarah's story had convinced her to pursue her goal anyway. My dad keeps saying I'm too small for this kind of work, the recruit said. But you're not much bigger than I am and you made it through. Sarah placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. Your dad loves you and wants to protect you, she said. But don't let other people's fears become your limitations. The only way to know what you're capable of is to try. A male recruit from Texas approached next. Ma'am, I have to admit, when I first heard about women in SEAL training, I wasn't sure it was a good idea. But after hearing your story and seeing what you accomplished, I realized I was wrong. If you can meet the standards, then gender doesn't matter. These conversations reminded Sarah why her story had become important beyond her own personal experience. Each person who heard it and changed their thinking about what was possible was extending its impact far beyond that night in the gym. On her flight home, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed. She was now working as a consultant for military training programs, helping to develop new methods for preparing soldiers for real-world combat situations. The gym had promoted her to head trainer and was using her story in their marketing materials. She had even started writing a book about her experiences. But the most significant change was in how she saw herself. For years, she had tried to hide her military background, to blend in and avoid attention. Now she understood that her experiences could help others push beyond their own perceived limitations. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Williams. "Thought you'd want to know. All 4 suspects pled guilty today. They're looking at significant prison time. The prosecutor said your testimony was crucial in securing the convictions." Justice had been served, but Sarah knew the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in every young woman who decided to pursue a military career because she had seen that it was possible. It was in every person who refused to accept other people's definitions of what they could or couldn't accomplish. When Sarah arrived home, she found a package waiting for her. Inside was a framed photo from her SEAL graduation ceremony, signed by all of her former instructors. Master Chief Thompson had included a note. "Martinez, you've proven that the best warriors aren't always the biggest or the loudest. They're the ones who refuse to quit when things get difficult. Keep setting the example." Sarah hung the photo in her living room, next to a newspaper clipping from the day after the gym incident. The headline read, "Local Woman Uses Navy SEAL. Training to Stop Robbery." At the time, she had been embarrassed by the attention. Now she understood that the headline told a much bigger story than just one night's events. That evening, Sarah received a call from her brother Marcus. "I saw the video of your speech at the training center," he said. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. Not just for what you did in that gym, but for how you've handled everything since then." "Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot. I have to ask you something, though. Are you happy with how everything turned out? I know you never wanted this kind of attention." Sarah considered the question carefully. "I wouldn't have chosen to become famous," she said. "But I'm glad my story is helping other people. If one young woman joins the military because she saw what I accomplished, then all the attention was worth it." After hanging up, Sarah sat on her couch and looked at the framed photo of her graduation. She thought about the scared young woman who had started SEAL training 3 years earlier, convinced she would probably fail but determined to try anyway. That woman could never have imagined where the journey would lead. The 4 men who had trapped her in the gym that night had no idea they were attacking someone who had spent years preparing for exactly that kind of situation. They had seen only what they expected to see: a victim. Instead, they had encountered a warrior who refused to be intimidated by superior numbers or size. Sarah's story had become proof that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about other people's capabilities. The quiet gym trainer was a Navy SEAL. The small woman was a formidable fighter. The person who looked like an easy target was actually someone who had trained for years to handle whatever challenges life might present. As Sarah prepared for bed, she felt grateful for the path that had brought her to this point. The gym incident had forced her to reveal her military background, but it had also shown her the value of sharing her experiences with others. She was no longer hiding who she was or what she had accomplished. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to inspire others, to challenge assumptions about what women could achieve in military service, and to demonstrate that true strength came, not from size or aggression, but from preparation, determination, and the refusal to accept defeat. Sarah Martinez had learned these lessons in the most demanding military training program in the world, and she would spend the rest of her life sharing them with anyone willing to listen. Sarah Martinez had always been underestimated. At 28, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with gentle brown eyes that seemed too soft for the harsh realities of military life. When she first arrived at Forward Operating Base, Crimson in Afghanistan, the seasoned soldiers barely glanced in her direction. To them, she was just another medical officer, probably fresh out of training, who would likely spend her deployment treating minor cuts and handing out aspirin. The base was a sprawling collection of concrete barriers, makeshift buildings, and dust that seemed to coat everything within minutes of cleaning. Located in one of the most volatile regions of Helmand Province, it housed over 300 personnel, including an elite Navy SEAL team that had recently been deployed for high-risk operations. The SEALs kept to themselves mostly, their reputation preceding them wherever they went. They were the kind of men who had seen everything, done everything, and trusted very few people outside their tight-knit brotherhood. Commander Jake Reynolds was their leader. a decorated veteran with 15 years of special operations experience. His weathered face told stories of countless missions, and his piercing blue eyes had a way of sizing up people within seconds of meeting them. When he first saw Sarah organizing medical supplies in the base clinic, he made the same assumption as everyone else. She looked more like someone who belonged in a suburban hospital than a war zone. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Texas, the daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher. She had always been drawn to helping others, but her path to military service was unconventional. After completing her nursing degree, she had worked in emergency rooms for several years, dealing with everything from car accidents to gang violence. The experience had toughened her in ways that weren't immediately visible, teaching her to remain calm under pressure and make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. When she decided to join the Army as a medical officer, her family was worried but proud. Her training had been rigorous, including combat medical courses that pushed her physical and mental limits. She learned to operate in hostile environments, treat battlefield injuries, and work with minimal resources. But theory and practice were two different things, and she knew that her real test would come in the field. The base's medical facility was better equipped than many field hospitals, but it was still a far cry from the sterile, well-staffed emergency rooms she was used to. She had 2 medics working under her supervision, both experienced enlisted men who had been deployed multiple times. They were respectful but distant, clearly wondering what this small-town nurse could teach them about military medicine. During her first week, Sarah treated the usual array of minor injuries and illnesses: heat exhaustion from soldiers not drinking enough water, cuts and bruises from training exercises, and the occasional bout of food poisoning from questionable local cuisine that some of the younger soldiers couldn't resist trying. She worked efficiently and professionally, but she could sense that she hadn't yet earned the respect of the men and women she was supposed to care for. The turning point began on a Tuesday morning, when intelligence reports started coming in about increased enemy activity in the surrounding area. The base commander called a briefing for all senior personnel, including the medical team. Sarah found herself sitting in a room full of hardened military professionals, many of whom had been in combat for years. She listened carefully as they discussed patrol routes, threat assessments, and contingency plans. Commander Reynolds outlined a mission that his SEAL team would be undertaking in 2 days. They were tasked with disrupting a major supply route used by insurgents to move weapons and personnel through the region. The mission was considered high risk, with intelligence suggesting that the enemy was well armed and prepared for confrontation. Sarah made mental notes about the number of personnel involved and the types of injuries she might need to be prepared for. As the briefing concluded, she approached Commander Reynolds with questions about medical support protocols. He answered her queries politely but briefly, his tone suggesting that he didn't expect her to play a significant role in anything beyond basic first aid. Sarah didn't take offense. She had encountered similar attitudes throughout her career. She had learned that the best way to change people's perceptions was through actions, not words. That evening, Sarah spent hours reviewing trauma protocols and checking her medical supplies. She organized everything systematically, creating easy access kits for different types of emergencies. Her medics watched with mild interest, still unsure what to make of their new supervising officer. They had worked with several medical officers over the years, and most followed predictable patterns. Sarah seemed different, more thorough and intense in her preparations, but they reserved judgment. The base settled into its nighttime routine, with guards taking their positions and most personnel retiring to their quarters. Sarah remained in the medical facility, going over scenarios in her mind and making sure everything was ready for whatever might come. She had learned long ago that preparation was the key to success in emergency medicine. The more ready you were for the unexpected, the better your chances of saving lives when things went wrong. As she finally made her way to her quarters, Sarah passed by the SEAL team's area. She could see lights on in their briefing room, where they were undoubtedly going over their mission plans one final time. These men were professionals who left nothing to chance, and she respected that dedication. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for all of them, and she was determined to be ready for whatever role she might need to play in keeping them safe. The helicopter ride to the SEAL team's location was the longest 25 minutes of Sarah's life. Seated behind pilot Captain Mike Torres, a veteran aviator with over 200 combat missions, she checked and rechecked her medical supplies, while the landscape of Afghanistan rolled beneath them. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. She was about to walk into an active combat zone where trained soldiers were fighting for their lives. Captain Torres had initially resisted the mission, arguing that landing in hostile territory with limited backup was against every protocol in the book. However, after listening to the increasingly desperate radio communications from Commander Reynolds, he agreed to attempt the dangerous insertion. His helicopter was a modified Black Hawk equipped for medical evacuations, but it wasn't designed for combat operations in heavily contested areas. As they approached the coordinates, Sarah could see smoke rising from several locations on the ground. The rocky terrain was scarred with blast craters and debris from the ongoing firefight. Through her headset, she could hear the staccato reports of automatic weapons fire and the occasional explosion of grenades. The enemy forces were clearly well-equipped and determined to eliminate the trapped SEAL team. Captain Torres circled the area twice, searching for a suitable landing zone while avoiding the most dangerous areas of enemy fire. Sarah studied the terrain below, trying to identify the best route to reach the team's defensive position. The SEALs were entrenched behind a series of large boulders about 800 meters from the nearest safe landing site. She would have to cover that distance on foot while carrying 60 pounds of medical equipment. The landing was rough and quick. Captain Torres touched down in a narrow valley that provided some protection from direct enemy fire, but he couldn't shut down the engines. The helicopter needed to be ready for immediate takeoff to avoid becoming a stationary target. Sarah grabbed her medical pack and jumped out, immediately feeling the impact of the thin mountain air and the intensity of the combat situation. The sound of gunfire was much louder now, echoing off the rocky walls of the surrounding hills. Sarah could distinguish between the sharp cracks of American rifles and the deeper thuds of enemy weapons. Occasionally, she heard Commander Reynolds' voice shouting orders to his men, his words barely audible over the chaos of battle. She oriented herself using the compass and began moving toward the team's position. The terrain was more challenging than it had appeared from the air. Loose rocks shifted under her feet, threatening to send her tumbling down steep slopes. Thorny scrub bushes caught at her uniform and equipment. The sun was blazing overhead and the temperature had to be over 100 degrees. Sarah had trained for conditions like this, but training never fully prepared you for the real thing. Halfway to the team's position, enemy fire began impacting near her location. Bullets ricocheted off rocks just meters away, sending fragments of stone flying in all directions. Sarah dropped to the ground and crawled behind a large boulder, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had never been under direct fire before, and the experience was both terrifying and surreal. For several minutes she remained pinned down while enemy fighters tried to locate her exact position. Sarah used the time to study the terrain ahead and plan her route more carefully. She could see muzzle flashes from enemy weapons positioned on the ridgeline above the SEAL team's location. The insurgents had indeed chosen their ambush site well, with elevated positions that provided excellent fields of fire. When the shooting subsided, Sarah resumed her advance, moving more carefully and using available cover more effectively. She could now hear individual voices from the SEAL team's position, including someone calling for medical assistance. The urgency in their voices drove her forward despite the obvious dangers. These men were depending on her to reach them with the medical supplies they desperately needed. The final approach to the team's defensive position was the most dangerous part of the journey. Sarah had to cross an open area about 50 meters wide, where she would be exposed to enemy observation and fire. She waited for what seemed like the right moment, then sprinted across the clearing with her medical pack bouncing on her back. Bullets whined overhead, but none found their mark. She tumbled into the rocky outcropping where the SEAL team had taken shelter, immediately greeted by the sight that would haunt her for years to come. 12 of America's most elite soldiers were scattered among the rocks, some returning fire while others tended to their wounded teammates. The smell of gunpowder, blood, and fear hung heavy in the confined space. Commander Reynolds looked up in shock as Sarah rolled behind the same boulder where he was directing his men's defensive fire. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his uniform torn in several places. For a moment, he seemed unable to process what he was seeing. The last thing he had expected was for the base's medical officer to appear in the middle of his firefight. The wounded soldiers were in various states of distress. Sergeant First Class Danny Morrison lay unconscious with a severe chest wound that was making breathing difficult. Petty Officer Carlos Ramirez was conscious but had lost significant blood from a leg injury that had severed an artery. 3 other team members had shrapnel wounds and concussion symptoms from grenade explosions. The team medic, despite his own shoulder injury, had done his best with limited supplies. Sarah immediately went to work, her emergency room training taking over despite the chaos surrounding her. She assessed each wounded soldier quickly, prioritizing treatment based on the severity of their injuries. The unconscious SEAL with the chest wound needed immediate attention to prevent his lung from collapsing completely. The soldier with the leg injury required emergency surgery to repair the damaged artery. Working under fire was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in civilian emergency rooms. Every few minutes, she had to stop her medical procedures and take cover as enemy bullets impacted nearby. The constant noise made communication difficult, and the rocky ground made it challenging to position patients properly. Despite these obstacles, she began the process of stabilizing the most critically injured soldiers. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision as she worked on Sergeant Morrison's chest wound. The bullet had punctured his lung, causing a tension pneumothorax that would be fatal without immediate intervention. Using a large gauge needle, she carefully inserted a chest tube to relieve the pressure and allow his lung to re-expand. The procedure was complicated by the need to duck for cover every few minutes as enemy fire intensified. Commander Reynolds watched in amazement as the small nurse who had seemed so out of place just days earlier worked with the confidence of a seasoned combat surgeon. Her movements were deliberate and efficient, showing no signs of panic despite the chaos surrounding them. She had transformed from someone he barely noticed into the most important person in his team's survival. While monitoring Morrison's breathing, Sarah simultaneously worked on Petty Officer Ramirez's arterial bleeding. The injury was severe, with blood loss approaching critical levels. She applied a tourniquet above the wound and established an intravenous line to begin fluid resuscitation. Her portable blood products, which she had insisted on bringing despite their weight, proved invaluable in stabilizing his condition. The other wounded soldiers received rapid but thorough assessments. Staff Sergeant Williams had multiple shrapnel wounds across his back and arms. None immediately life-threatening, but all requiring cleaning and dressing to prevent infection. Petty Officer Johnson was suffering from a severe concussion that had left him disoriented and nauseous. Corporal Martinez had sustained a compound fracture of his forearm that needed immediate splinting and pain management. What impressed Commander Reynolds most was how Sarah managed to coordinate her medical efforts while remaining aware of the tactical situation. She positioned herself and her patients to provide maximum protection from enemy fire, and she timed her most critical procedures during lulls in the fighting. Her emergency room experience had taught her to work efficiently under pressure, skills that translated perfectly to the battlefield environment. The team's original medic, despite his own shoulder wound, proved invaluable in assisting Sarah's efforts. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Rodriguez had years of combat experience and understood the unique challenges of battlefield medicine. Together, they created an effective partnership that maximized their limited resources while providing the best possible care under impossible circumstances. As Sarah worked, she could hear Commander Reynolds coordinating with base command over the radio. The rescue operation was still being organized, but it would be at least 2 more hours before ground forces could fight their way to their position. Air support was limited due to the enemy's anti-aircraft capabilities, and medical evacuation. Helicopters couldn't safely approach until the area was secured. The tactical situation remained precarious. The enemy forces had the SEAL team surrounded and were maintaining steady pressure with automatic weapons fire and occasional grenades. Commander Reynolds estimated there were at least 20 insurgents in fortified positions, making any breakout attempt extremely dangerous. especially with multiple wounded soldiers who couldn't move quickly or fight effectively. Sarah made the difficult decision to perform field surgery on Petty Officer Ramirez's arterial injury. The temporary tourniquet had stopped the bleeding, but it couldn't remain in place indefinitely without causing permanent damage to his leg. Working with minimal equipment in far from sterile conditions, she carefully accessed the damaged blood vessel and performed a repair that would hold until they could reach proper surgical facilities. The procedure took nearly an hour to complete, during which time the enemy launched 2 major assaults on the team's defensive position. Sarah found herself lying flat against the rocks, protecting her patient's exposed surgical site while bullets ricocheted just inches away. The psychological pressure was enormous, but she maintained her focus on the medical tasks that needed to be completed. Commander Reynolds later said that watching Sarah perform surgery under fire was one of the most inspiring things he had witnessed in 15 years of military service. She never showed fear, never hesitated when critical decisions needed to be made, and never lost sight of her primary mission to save lives. Her presence had a calming effect on the entire team, giving them hope when the situation seemed hopeless. Wounded soldiers began to stabilize under Sarah's care. Morrison's breathing improved as his lung re-expanded, and his consciousness gradually returned. Ramirez's blood pressure stabilized after the arterial repair and fluid resuscitation. The other injured team members received proper wound care and pain management that allowed them to remain alert and aware of their surroundings. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's medical supplies began to run low. She had brought as much equipment as she could carry, but extended treatment of multiple trauma patients in field conditions consumed resources quickly. She began rationing her remaining supplies while sending urgent requests to base command for additional medical support. The enemy seemed to recognize that medical care was being provided to the wounded Americans. Their fire became more focused and aggressive, as if they were trying to prevent the soldiers from receiving treatment. Sarah found herself becoming a primary target, forcing her to work from increasingly awkward positions while maintaining cover behind the rocks. Despite the dangers, Sarah refused to leave her patients. When Commander Reynolds suggested that she should evacuate with the next helicopter insertion, she firmly declined. Her wounded soldiers were not yet stable enough for transport, and abandoning them would likely result in preventable deaths. She was committed to seeing the mission through to its completion, regardless of the personal risk involved. The sun began to set over the Afghan mountains, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The temperature started to drop, which would help with heat-related stress but would create new challenges for treating shock and hypothermia in the wounded soldiers. Sarah prepared for what might be a long night of fighting and medical care, knowing that the next few hours would test everyone's limits of endurance and courage. As darkness fell over the mountain battlefield, Sarah faced her greatest challenge yet. The dropping temperature threatened to send her wounded patients into hypothermic shock, while the enemy forces used the cover of night to move closer to the SEAL team's defensive position. She could hear them talking in hushed voices, coordinating what appeared to be preparation for a final assault, designed to eliminate the trapped Americans. Commander Reynolds gathered his remaining effective soldiers for a tactical briefing. With 5 men wounded and unable to fight, his defensive capabilities were severely reduced. The enemy had spent the day studying their positions and would likely attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah listened to the discussion while continuing to monitor her patient's vital signs, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether her medical efforts had been worthwhile. The first major assault came at 2200 hours. Enemy fighters approached from 3 different directions, using the darkness and their knowledge of the terrain to get within 50 meters of the SEAL positions before opening fire. The intensity of the attack was unlike anything they had experienced during the day, with automatic weapons fire and grenades creating a deadly crossfire that forced everyone to take the lowest possible cover. Sarah found herself pressed against the rocky ground, using her own body to shield Sergeant Morrison from flying debris while trying to maintain his chest tube and intravenous lines. The noise was deafening, with the sound of bullets striking rocks just inches away mixing with the shouts of men fighting for their lives. She had never imagined that combat could be so chaotic and terrifying. During a brief lull in the fighting, Sarah made a decision that would later be described as either incredibly brave or completely insane. She realized that her patients needed to be moved to more protected positions within the defensive perimeter, but the movement would expose both her and the wounded soldiers to enemy fire. Without hesitation, she began dragging the most critically injured men to better cover. Petty Officer Ramirez was the first to be moved. Despite weighing nearly 200 pounds and being only semi-conscious, Sarah managed to pull him 15 feet to a depression in the rocks that provided better protection from enemy fire. She made 4 more trips, each time exposing herself to intense combat while relocating wounded soldiers to safer positions within their small defensive area. Commander Reynolds was amazed by Sarah's actions under fire. She moved with purpose and determination, seemingly oblivious to the bullets impacting around her. Her focus remained entirely on her patients' welfare, even when her own survival was clearly in jeopardy. Her example inspired the other SEALs to fight with renewed determination, knowing that their medic was willing to risk everything for their lives. The fighting continued intermittently throughout the night, with enemy forces probing for weaknesses in the American defensive positions. Sarah used the quiet periods to provide additional medical care, changing dressings, administering pain medication, and monitoring for signs of infection or complications. She had been working for over 10 hours under extreme conditions, but showed no signs of fatigue or diminished performance. At 0300 hours, rescue finally arrived in the form of a full infantry company supported by Apache helicopter gunships. The sound of approaching American helicopters was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. The enemy forces, faced with overwhelming firepower, began to withdraw from their positions and disappear into the surrounding mountains. The extraction process was carefully coordinated to ensure the safe evacuation of all wounded personnel. Sarah supervised the loading of each patient onto medical evacuation helicopters, providing detailed briefings to the flight medics about each soldier's injuries and treatment requirements. Her thorough documentation and preparation ensured that proper medical care could continue during transport to the main hospital facility. Sergeant Morrison, who had been unconscious for most of the ordeal, regained awareness as he was being loaded onto the helicopter. His first words were to ask about the other wounded soldiers, demonstrating the selfless attitude that characterized the entire SEAL team. Sarah was able to tell him that all 12 members of his team were alive and would recover fully from their injuries. The helicopter ride back to base was surreal after the intensity of the combat experience. Sarah sat quietly among her patients, monitoring their conditions while processing the events of the past 18 hours. She had performed battlefield surgery, survived multiple enemy assaults, and saved the lives of 12 elite soldiers who had initially seen her as just another medical officer. Commander Reynolds made a point of sitting beside Sarah during the flight back to base. For the first time since she had arrived at their defensive position, he had an opportunity to really look at the small nurse who had changed everything. Her uniform was torn and dirty, her face was streaked with dirt and dried blood, and her hands showed cuts and scrapes from crawling over rocks under fire. What struck him most was her eyes. They still held the same gentle compassion he had noticed during her first week at the base, but now they also showed the confidence and determination that came from proving herself under the most extreme circumstances possible. She had earned something that couldn't be taught or awarded, the absolute respect of men who had previously dismissed her as inexperienced and unproven. As the base came into view, Sarah could see lights and activity around the medical facility, where additional doctors and nurses were preparing to receive the wounded soldiers. Her work was nearly finished, but she knew that her role in the SEAL team's survival would be remembered and talked about for years to come. She had gone from being overlooked to becoming a legend in the span of a single day. The helicopter touched down at the base's landing zone, where a full medical team was waiting to take over patient care. Sarah provided detailed handoffs for each wounded soldier, ensuring continuity of care as they were transferred to the base hospital. Only after all of her patients were safely in other hands did she finally allow herself to consider the magnitude of what had just occurred. The base hospital buzzed with activity as Sarah's patients were wheeled into treatment rooms for comprehensive medical evaluation. Despite her exhaustion, she remained at the facility to ensure proper continuity of care and to answer questions about the field treatments she had provided. The base's chief medical officer, Colonel Patricia Williams, had been following the situation via radio and was eager to debrief with Sarah about her unprecedented battlefield performance. Word of Sarah's actions had spread throughout the base, within hours of the team's return. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged her presence a week earlier now looked at her with unmistakable respect and admiration. The story of the small-town nurse who had voluntarily flown into combat to save a trapped SEAL team was already becoming the stuff of military legend. Commander Reynolds spent the next morning visiting each of his wounded team members in the hospital. All 12 soldiers were stable and expected to make full recoveries, though several would require additional surgery and extended rehabilitation. As he moved from bed to bed, each man made a point of asking about Sarah and expressing their gratitude for her life-saving actions under fire. Sergeant Morrison, now fully conscious and breathing normally, struggled to find words to describe what Sarah's arrival had meant to the trapped team. He explained to Commander Reynolds that her presence had given them hope when the situation seemed hopeless, and that her professional competence had made the difference between life and death for several team members. 3 days after the rescue, Commander Reynolds requested a formal meeting with Sarah in his office. She arrived expecting a routine debriefing about medical procedures and lessons learned from the operation. Instead, she found herself facing not only the SEAL commander but also the base commanding officer, the regional medical commander, and several other senior officials who had flown in specifically to meet her. Commander Reynolds began the meeting by reading from an official citation that he had prepared documenting Sarah's actions during the rescue operation. The formal language couldn't capture the full impact of what she had done, but it provided an official record of her courage, professional skill, and life-saving medical intervention under extreme combat conditions. The medal ceremony took place the following week in front of the entire base population. Sarah stood at attention as Commander Reynolds pinned the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device on her uniform, an honor rarely awarded to medical personnel and almost never to someone with such limited combat experience. The citation specifically mentioned her voluntary insertion into hostile territory and her performance of life-saving surgery under direct enemy fire. What moved Sarah most during the ceremony wasn't the formal recognition or the applause from hundreds of fellow soldiers. It was seeing all 12 members of the SEAL team, those who were able to walk, standing in the front row of the assembled formation. Several were still on crutches or in wheelchairs, but they had insisted on being present to honor the woman who had saved their lives. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a representative from the Army Medical Command, who offered her an assignment to the Special Operations Medical Training Center. Her combat experience and demonstrated ability to perform under extreme pressure made her an ideal candidate to train other medical officers for high-risk deployments. It was an opportunity that would fast-track her military career and provide challenges she had never imagined. The decision to accept the new assignment wasn't difficult for Sarah. Her experience with the SEAL team had shown her that she was capable of much more than she had ever believed possible. The frightened nurses who had arrived at the base just weeks earlier had been transformed by combat into a confident medical officer who understood her own capabilities and limitations. Commander Reynolds made a point of writing a personal letter of recommendation for Sarah's new assignment. In it, he described her as one of the most courageous and competent military medical professionals he had encountered in his 15-year career. He specifically noted that her actions had not only saved the lives of his team members, but had also inspired everyone who witnessed her performance under fire. The wounded SEALs gradually returned to duty over the following months, each carrying with them a story about the nurse who had changed their perception of what heroism looked like. Staff Sergeant Williams later said that Sarah had taught him that courage didn't always come in the form he expected, and that some of the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with medical knowledge and an unwavering commitment to saving lives. Sarah's story spread beyond the immediate military community, eventually reaching her hometown in Texas, where it was featured in the local newspaper. Her parents read with pride and amazement about their daughter's transformation, from small-town emergency room nurse to decorated combat medical officer. They had always known she was special, but even they were surprised by the courage she had shown under fire. Years later, when Sarah had become a training instructor at the Special Operations Medical Center, she would often tell her students that heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about recognizing when someone needed help and being willing to act despite your fear. She had learned that lesson herself during 18 hours of combat in the mountains of Afghanistan, when 12 elite soldiers discovered that their lives depended on someone they had initially dismissed as just a nurse. The bond between Sarah and the SEAL team members remained strong long after their deployment ended. They stayed in touch through letters, emails, and occasional reunions, forming a brotherhood that transcended rank and military specialization. Commander Reynolds often said that his team had been saved not just by Sarah's medical skills, but by her refusal to accept the limitations that others had placed on her capabilities. She had proven that heroism could come from the most unexpected sources, and that courage under fire was measured not by physical strength, but by determination to do what was right regardless of personal risk.